Okay, in today's lecture, we are going to discuss about the community ecology. Um, as we already know, so we have already discussed the individual ecology, the population ecology, and the next level, that's the community ecology. When come to your mind, the term community, what's a community means? Uh, we all know that we talk about the human communities. But in this case, we are talking about the animal communities or even maybe sometimes plant communities. Um, in very general terms, we know that the community is like any collection of populations. Right? That is the literal meaning. Right? Any collection of a population we can call as community. Now, but in ecology, we call communities assemblage of species, like assemblage. The term assemblage actually we use for like, you loosely arranged. Right? So in this case, a loosely arranged uh, group of populations. So as you can see in the bottom left, there is a coral reef with some corals and a lot of fish and other maybe sponges and a lot of other different species. And the left top one, this one here, you see some plants as well as some species of birds, but there may be other species we might not notice here. And on the right, we have another that some forest area or a mountain area with some shrubs, grassland and woodland. Right? So we can call this as community. But in the here, if it is this case, it can be a group of birds. Sometimes we call the different flocks, right? And how it is different or it is a community or not, how are we going to decide whether it is a community or not, right? So that's what we are going to discuss in today's lecture. So what really is a community, right? Is there a particular structure in the community, or it's something arbitrary, or it is something loosely arranged, right? What if there is a structure, so what kind of a structure is there? And if there is a community, something called community, then how are we going to determine that community? And then is there any indices or any way that we can measure the communities? So these are the things that we are going to discuss, and as well as there are a lot of definitions related to the community or community ecology. So these are the things that we are going to discuss today. Right? Now, you have heard about something called this jigsaw puzzles, aren't you? You know what is a jigsaw puzzle, right? So in this case, these everything's are nicely arranged, right? So now the question we have, it is something like a community, something like this, nicely arranged, or it is something like this. So it's just like a parts. You have to put them together to make it something like a jigsaw puzzle, right? Or it's something very loosely arranged, and then you have to try to put them together to make a like a complete one. So that's we have to decide whether community is something structured or not, right? Now, if it has a structure, then how this is organized, how many species are there, right? And how they are distributed, right? Then we have to decide on these aspects as well, right? So let's see how and what is really a community.
When groups of organisms naturally occur together and interact in a specific area, an ecological community is formed. Within a community, a network forms in which species are connected because of direct interactions they have with each other. For example, consider the diversity of species that inhabit a tropical rainforest. From the birds that live in the canopy created by trees, to the snakes that feed on the frogs, several interactions take place within this community. Because of these interactions, every organism must face the challenge of survival, but in different ways. Each organism thus plays a specific role within its community. The role of a species within an ecosystem is called the species ecological niche. A more detailed definition of a niche is that it is the sum of all the interactions by a species, both with the living and non-living components in its environment. Keep in mind that a niche is not the same as a habitat. Habitat describes the physical area where an organism lives, while niche focuses on the organism's job or role within that habitat. For example, a dung beetle of South Africa specifically lives in and feeds on the dung of wild elephants and buffalo. Dung beetles live in many habitats, including savannas and farmlands. The dung beetle's niche, however, includes its job of breaking down dung to more rapidly add nutrients back into the soil. As the number of different species increases in a community, biodiversity also increases. However, when biodiversity declines within a community, ecological succession can occur, making an entire community less stable or unable to withstand disturbances that affect its overall structure and function. Ecological succession is a series of progressive changes in species composition that happens after a disturbance in an ecosystem. One example of an ecological succession is the migration of birds during a natural disaster, such as a hurricane. When a hurricane destroys an entire habitat, it can cause species structure to change as old species leave and new species move into the habitat. In the event that a community becomes unstable, two types of ecological succession can occur: primary or secondary succession. Primary succession is when all the organisms have been removed from the environment, as occurs after a volcanic eruption. Secondary succession is
Right. I hope you got some idea about a community here. So, as the video mentioned, there is some structure within a community, right? So there is some species composition, right? There is some structure, but that structure not really something you can map, but there is some kind of a structure within that, right? But the difference is the communities are dynamic, right? Because it's not something fixed. So species can change all the time. They can come, they can go out, right? So the community structure within a community, it can change over the time, right? So that's something we have to keep in mind. Um, the other thing, actually, the definition, or even for the ecologists, actually the communities are not really defined what really a community means. Right? So of course you can define in different ways, but there are different views by different ecologists. Some call it as the individualistic concept, right? As you can see, right? How the species function within a community. It can be individualistic concept, right? Now, in this concept, it mentioned as nothing more than an aggregation of species that happen to occur together at one place. Right? So it says that no particular thing, but it's like some sort of a random, or right? It just arbitrarily they join together in one place, and we can call them as a community, right? And on the other, we call the holistic concept. It's sometimes some ecologists think that it's some sort of a very complex thing. It's like we can call it as a super organism. Like they are together, they can function as a one, right? But something it's not really realistic. So the most ecologists actually believe that's more individualistic, right? The communities are more or less um, the single species happen to occur together, right? So in simple terms, you can take it as a community, right? Right. So that's a community. Now you can see even within a food web actually. Right? So here I have shown you a food web, and even that food web actually can be a community because there are a lot of interaction between different species. So in this case, so this can be considered as a community as well, right? Now this is the problem. Sometimes even in an ecosystem you can see this kind of a food web. Then so we can think of that this is a ecosystem, but in a community we consider on the biotic part, that the organism part, but the ecosystem, that's all the living and non-living everything. That's where the difference here, right? Okay, so uh, we know about these different food webs, but as you can see, so food web for a grassland community, right? So it's a community. Right? Definitely, there are some interaction between the individuals in this community, so we can call this as a grassland community. Right? So that's why I said you can call this even as a grassland ecosystem, but only the difference here, if it is an ecosystem, then there is a biotic component as well. But in a community, we just talk about the biotic component or the organisms, right? Hope it is clear to you, right? Um, and similarly, there are a lot of different communities that we can uh, talk about, right? Now, the important thing is in a community is there are interaction between the individuals, right? Between individuals, there are some interactions. So even between the populations. So these interactions, actually based on that interaction, actually we can determine what kind of a relationship they have, right? And the other important thing is that these relationships, some of these relationship can be like beneficial for one species or for the both, or the other may be negative for the one species in many cases, not the both, right? So based on that, actually, we can determine what kind of a relationship do they have in a community, like between individuals, right? Now, to make this thing very clear, so I have formulated sort of a chart here on your right side. What kind of interaction do they have, and what you can name this relationship, right? What kind of a relationship it does, right? So I don't want to explain in detail, and these things. And we have learned like these terms, competition and mutualism and commensalism, even maybe during your school time, you have heard about these things, commensalism, mutualism, predation and competition like things, right? Consumption is actually a predation, right? Now you see in the chart, it's mentioned the interaction between the the two groups or two individuals, that the one benefits, the others also benefits. And this kind of a relationship, you can call it as a mutualism. Both species got benefits, and where one species got benefit, the other one no harm or not affected, then it's a commensalism, right? So You know these examples, the whale and the barnacle relationship, and sea anemone and clownfish relationship with the mutualism and the commensalism. And the other one is the third type of relationship, the benefit to one species or one individual, whereas the others got harmed. This one is mostly the parasitism, for example, right? Even the predation, one is benefited where the others got harmed, right? So likewise, you can formulate a nice chart with this relationship, and that's where you get the relationship, right? Right. Okay. Now I have a blank table here, right? And you have the species A on the top and the species B on the left side. Now, if you are going to fill in this chart, the chart, there are negative, 0, and positive. And again, even to this side is the negative, 0, and positive. Now, if you fill this chart, like by looking at the interaction between the A and B, you see it's the negative and negative, right? Negative versus negative. That means this kind of a relationship is called competition, because any competition, usually the competition is between like closely related individuals or groups, and when they are, because they have to compete for the same resources. So this kind of a relationship, negative is the competition. Then the other one is, if you take the neutral and neutral from both sides, right, it's called the neutralism, no interaction. Now this is the difference, in a community, though there are a lot of species, even there can be some interactions. I mean, there is no particular relationship between the species A and B. Of course, they might have a relationship with other species, but not with this particular species. So in this case, it's a neutralism. And the third one, if you feel this side, that the positive, right? That is the mutualism. Both get benefits, the positive versus positive, right? And you can fill in all these and you will get some sort of relationship. You see, the positive and negative, that this also the same, but the other side, that is the antagonism or predation or parasitism, right? One benefited whereas the other got harmed, and that is the antagonism or the something against the predation and parasitism. Then the other relationship is the neutral and harm. One is neutral, no harm, and whereas the other got harm, is that's the amensalism, right? And the last relationship is the positive and neutral, that is the commensalism, right? Where one got benefit, the other one unharmed. So there's no particular harm to them, but the one got benefit. I hope you actually learned these terms even previously, maybe for your advanced level or even during your school time, but you might not think what kind of a relationship are they. I think now it is very clear by just looking at this graph, sorry, this chart, right? So it's very clear what kind of relationships are there. So we can take so many examples for this different types of interaction between the species in a community, right? So again, remember, we are talking here the interaction between the species in a community, right? It's not really the individuals. Of course, the individuals may be involved, but as you can see, this is the interaction between the species and the species B, species A versus species B, right? So the predation or actually the competition in this case, right? And that is the negative, both got negative. The predation is one positive, one negative. So there are many examples here. The last week we discussed about the relationship between the hare and the fox, and that relationship is a predator-prey relationship. So which you already know. I'm not going to actually explain these things. And the other type of relationship is the competition. No, it's the minus minus. Both got the negative relationship, negative interaction. So both get harmed actually from the competition. And the other one, the amensalism, right? Because amensalism is only one is harmed, but the other one is unaffected, right? So even I have given the examples here, so you can read once I share this slide with you, right? So this is, for example, a commensalism, barnacles versus whale, as I mentioned before. In this case, whales are not really get harmed from like attaching, but the barnacles, they actually find the whales as a way of movement, right? And likewise, you can have many examples for different type of these relationships, right? So you may better read a little bit more on this different relationship with some examples. In this case, a example for amensalism, where one get negative impact, whereas the other one is unaffected, right? That is amensalism. Then the commensalism, right? And where one get benefit, whereas the others unharmed. And the famous example is the cattle egret relationship, cattle versus egret, and this relationship, and there are many more. Even you see the butterfly feeding on a plant. So this can be sometimes commensalism, right? But it's not always, maybe sometimes some flowers that get benefit, especially for pollination. So in this case, so both get benefited, and then it's not really then commensalism. But in this case, if they are not really pollinating, then this is become commensalism, right? I hope this is clear to you, right? And the perfect example for this, the commensalism, is the relationship between the anemone, right? The anemone fission, or usually called as the clownfish. And you know this fish, if you have seen the movie called the Finding Nemo, you might have seen this fish. Actually, what you see in this image, actually we took somewhere in Trincomalee, actually in the some about 15-meter deep. One of our own photographs actually here. That is a relationship between the clownfish and the sea anemone, right? It's a big sea anemone and a clownfish. So this relationship, where we can call it as the commensalism, because the fish get some protection while hiding in this sea anemone, but the sea anemone is not really got any harm. So that's why it's called the commensalism. But some scientists call actually even the sea anemone has some benefits from the clownfish or the anemone fish, because they chase away some of the predators who try to prey on the coral polyps, right? So they fight. Even if you go close to this, they will try to attack you sometimes. So in this case, you can even call this as a more mutualistic relationship where both get benefit. but traditionally we call this as a commensalism, where one got benefits, that the fish, the clownfish, but the other one is unaffected. Right. Now you see the commensalism, amensalism, and mutualism. All these relationship, mutualistic relations, amensalism, and commensalism. Actually, they are all some sort of a symbiotic relationship. You know the term symbiosis or symbiotic relationship. They are actually the um, the relationship actually between two species. I'll come to that one later, right? So in literally we call mutualism when both species got benefit, right? Both are benefited in that relationship. That, as I mentioned before, the relationship between the bee and a flower is more mutualistic because they are serve as the pollinators, whereas in the previous case, the butterfly and this plant, so if they are not playing a role in as a pollinator, then it can be a commensalism, right? Hope this is clear. And there is a very good example for actually the symbiosis or symbiotic relationship, or we can call it as a mutualistic relationship. It's a type of symbiosis, but this is, in this case, it is a mutualistic where both get benefit, right? And then these examples come from the relationship between the coral polyp and one of the algae that is called zooxanthellae. I don't know whether you have heard about this zooxanthellae. Right? Zooxanthellae is actually a algae living in marine environments, right? This is a unique type of relationship actually. There is a relationship between the coral polyp and this zooxanthellae, right? And in the future, we will be talking about the coral reefs. You know, the unique coral reefs are actually made mainly because of this unique mutualistic relationship, or rather symbiotic relationship, because the zooxanthellae, as you can see here in an enlarged version, so it is microscopic, a tiny organism, algae, living inside the tissue of coral polyp, right? So you might think that they are like a parasite living inside the coral polyp, but they are not really parasite because they are just plant, you know, this algae. But so these algae that live within the coral polyp, or the cells of coral polyp, they produce oxygen, sugars, and fat for the corals, because the coral then feed on that excess sugars and fat, as well as they get the oxygen from zooxanthellae. But on the other hand, the zooxanthellae, they get the carbon dioxide and other nutrients, the phosphorus, nitrogen, and all nutrients from the coral polyp. You see how important this relationship, they both are benefited, and then that's why we call it as symbiotic relationship. Actually, this symbiotic relationship is more mutualistic relationship where both get benefits, right? Actually, if there is no this relationship or this symbiotic relationship between the zooxanthellae and coral polyp, there won't be any coral reefs. No? Coral reefs will die. Actually, the corals will die, not the coral reefs. The corals will die if there is no this symbiotic relationship. So it's very important for the coral to have this symbiotic relationship, right? So maybe in your later years we will discuss further, especially if you are doing aquatic resources management. We will talk a lot on this coral and zooxanthellae mutual relationships. Very important, right? So here you might have heard about something called the coral bleaching. Right? This coral is already bleached, whereas the one in behind is not bleached. This bleach coral means actually the zooxanthellae, they live in that tissue. They have gone out, right? Once they are removed from a coral, this is how they look like, and that is called coral bleaching, right? And when the maybe the temperature in the environment change, sometimes the the algae will go out, or even the coral polyp might chase them away from the coral when they are stressed, and eventually they will become bleach like this. And if the condition going to be continued for a long time, and then the coral will die thereafter, and then there is no any return. This coral will die forever, right? So this symbiotic relationship actually is very important for the that uh, coral species, right? Okay. So as I mentioned, all these mutualism and then different, they are more symbiotic relationship. They both can have some benefits or not, right? All right. So that's about the key interaction between the species within a community. And there are so many other different types of interaction and then ecological things in a community. And we don't have actually time to discuss everything, but there are some terms we try to understand. One of them is as we call the guild, not the guilt, right? It's the guild, Guild, guild. Guild means a group of species that have similar requirement and play similar role within a community, right? In this case, we call one guild, right? So this is very common in some birds, and then like a group. It's not the same species, different species with similar requirement, and they play a similar role in a community. And in this call, we call the ecological guild. It's a one guild in this case, in a particular area, right? If you are like, if you are going to study ecology further, then you have to actually find this kind of, or we can to separate some different guilds, even from the this kind of groups. In a tree, actually, in the top part of the tree may be shared by some communities. The bottom part, the middle part will be shared by different groups or the different communities. So eventually this all help to reduce the competition between the groups. And then, we call the habitat partitioning, and that will allow the different species to feed on different parts, and also that all reduce the competition for the same resource, right? So all these are actually some sort of adaptation from the animal to live in that particular environment, right? And we know that different shapes of birds, right? And then the Darwinian the theories that all actually came from this, because of this the ecological guild concept, right? So I don't want to go into detail, right? The other thing is how important these relationships between individuals, or rather between species, right? We'll take example predation, right? Predation, for example, a fox eating a rabbit in a forest, right? You might think, oh, that is so unnecessary. We shouldn't allow that predator to prey on rabbits. If you are going to stop that relationship, what will happen, right? So all these are ecological relationships. Sometimes this predation is very important in order to maintain the balance or within that ecosystem, right? So we have to think of in ecological point, right? Believing that this is a bad relationship between the predator and prey, but ecology is very important. If not, what will happen, right? This is an example. In this case, the starfish, they actually, they are predators. The prey is the barnacles, right? So they feed on barnacles. If they don't, what will happen? And the right side, you can see it like a explosive growth of barnacles in this case, because in the absence of the starfish, so they are going to have their population going to explode, right? And then you can see it's an exponential growth, as you can know. Right, now what will happen? So that will destroy the whole ecosystem, whole community, and eventually even the barnacles will die because they cannot withstand all the density, the competition, and the limited resources. Eventually, everybody will die if you don't manage this kind of a ecosystem. So that's very important to have this predator-prey relationship, right? And so in ecology, you know that some predators and some prey will have a lot of adaptation to, right? Predators will have adaptation to prey, to obtain the prey, and at the same time some prey will have adaptation to avoid by predation, right? So there are so many things to learn that I'm not going to go into that detail. For example, here the camouflage in some frog here, you can see they're perfectly camouflaged with the background, with the coloration, and then it's very difficult for any predator to spot them, right, by just looking at. So it's called the cryptic coloration. It's also camouflage, right? And then some animals use like we call the disruptive colors or the warning colors. For example, in this case, like this kind of colors, very colorful animals in particular, we know they are venomous, like some very colorful snakes, frogs, even the fish, not all, but they can be really poisonous. So, and this frog in this case, they actually give some warning to the others, don't eat me, I'm poisonous, something like that. They give some sort of warning, right? So usually if they see this kind of animal, they avoid prey on them, right? And likewise, there are so many adaptations actually. For example, mimicry. Mimicry is, I'm not too sure whether you have heard about this term. Mimicry is like you're trying to act like someone else. Like you not really act actually, you just look like someone else. Sorry, it's not the act. You look like someone else, but you are not really someone. You just you, but you just look like someone else, right? And there are many examples for the mimicry, and in this case is the monarch butterfly, right? Because the monarch butterfly in this case, they are like they we call them unpalatable for the birds. I mean, they can't eat it because when the monarch butterflies, when they are young, they eat some particular type of weed, called milkweed, especially the larval stage of this monarch butterfly. They eat that milkweed, and then that make the butterfly um, unpalatable, or the birds, they cannot eat them because just the taste different, right? They feel like an unusual taste, and they just throw them away, right? And you might have seen this, we sometimes try to eat something. If you can't accept, you just throw it away. Likewise, the monarch butterfly, they make the birds unpalatable. But there is another species, the one in the right, where it's called viscery butterfly. You see, it's very like a monarch butterfly, pretty much same, but except few differences. But you see, by mimicking in like this, they got protection that because the birds won't eat them, they believe in that they are a monarch butterfly, right? And similarly, there are many species like that. In this case, it's the coral snake versus scarlet king snake, right? Scarlet king snake and the coral snake looks very alike, but the one in the top, the coral snake, is really venomous, whereas the other one is not. But they, by resembling a coral snake, so they got some protection from the predators, right? Mimicry. Okay. Likewise, actually, there are so many adaptation within a community, right? For different interactions to be a prey or predator, or to protection from the prey, or to behave as a predator, or to their what sort of a mutualistic relationship. They have a lot of adaptations, right? Okay. And with that, let's move on to a little bit more terms actually in the community. To describe a community, we can use a lot of parameters. But before that, the definition for a biological community I have given here: an association of interacting species living in a particular area, right? So keep in mind an association of interacting species. There is some sort of interaction if it is a biological community, but usually we call, if we see a group of species, and we can call them as a community sometimes, and even without knowing that there is any close relationships or not, we can call them a biological community, because we really don't know what kind of relationship they have, right? You might not see some relationship between one species and the other, but in reality there can be, we don't know, right? So lack of our knowledge maybe, but there can be some reason. So in that case, we can consider them as a particular community. Anyway, so that's a biological community, so, or simply a community. Then there are some other terms that you need to clearly understand, right? Don't not don't, you have to try to understand the concept of this, or the definition of these terms. You need to be very clear about these definitions. For example, something like a species, the population, right? Species richness, the abundance, diversity. So these terms, you need to know exactly what it is, right? So if it is a species richness, it means the number of species, right? How many species are there, and that is a measure of species richness, right? How rich the community with species, how many species are there, right? The abundance is number of individual in that particular species, right? The number of species is the richness, and the abundance is number of individuals, not the species, right? Okay. What else? Right. The other terms are the evenness, right? Evenness. So what is evenness? Right. That is a measure of how the distribution of abundance. If you see how many individuals in that particular species in a community, and if they are like a more or same individual, number of individuals if are same, you can more even. The term, what the meaning of even. Even means sort of similar, right? If the abundance between the species is pretty much same, then we call the evenness is very high, right? So that is the evenness. That also a very good measure. in ecology. Right. The other one is species diversity. This is also something that that is confusing for many students. The term species diversity. That is the richness plus the abundance. Richness, again, the number of species. Abundance is the number of individuals in that particular species, right? So now together, if you take the abundance and the species richness or the number of species, that is what we call the species diversity. Most of the students and equally some ecologists or even like researchers, they believe that the species diversity is something related to the number of species. Not really. It's not only the number of species, that is the species richness. But if you combine that with the abundance, then you get the species diversity. So if you have to measure the species diversity, you have to measure number of species as well as number of individuals in each species, right? And that's where we have, if you are calculating the species diversity using some sort of an index or some sort of a formula, that's we have to consider both species richness as well as the abundance. Right, okay. And the other terms in a community, a little bit of a, you might think that they are a bit complicated, but not really. There are some more terms related to the community called the resistance, resilience, and recovery. Right. The resistance, resilience, and recovery is another couple of terms. And then what does it mean? The resilience means the ability for a particular community to return to its former situation after some sort of a change, right? After some change, their ability to come back to the situation where they had previous. So that is called the resilience. So, right, the speed with which a community returns to its former state after perturbation. The perturbation is some change or some impact. After that, their ability to come to a normal previous situation, right? Now, the second one is the resistance. You know that the resistance, the term implies that is the ability for them to withstand any change. I mean, to avoid, at the first place, to avoid any change, that is the resistance. So resilience is after changing to going back to that state, but the resistance is trying to not to change at the first instance. So it's the resistance. So if we take together resilience and the resistance, then we can call it as a community stability. Right? If a community to be stable, they need to have a high resilience and also resistance. Right? If this is good, then they become will have more stable communities. Right. And what other indices are there for species diversity? We have already discussed. So species diversity, remember again, that includes the species richness, that is the number of species in that particular community. Then the abundance, that is the number of individuals in each right, within that, right? Okay, so that is the species diversity. Now, I have shared here two tables, actually, not two tables here with in the left side, you see the species names. Then we have the number of individuals here. Then the relative abundance, relative as a percentage, to total. What the percentage abundance to their total, right? And then that is calculated here. As you can see, and species richness, of course, you can count number of species is here. So that's the species richness. Then we have the abundance. Now, if you look at the chart, the table on the left and right, so what you can say from the one in the left and right. So in terms of diversity, how you can compare these two, right? So what do you think, which, if you take this community, the left community as right community, which one is more diverse? That's something you have to decide by just looking at this one, but you won't be able to say it exactly. But how you can decide which one is more diverse is you have to look at how many species are there, how many species are there, and within that species, how many individuals are there. And not only that, you have to consider the evenness, like how evenly distributed their number. And you see in this case, in the right side, the species 1 and 2, they form 44% versus 39%, and then that's more than 75%, more than 80% actually of that population is made of these two species, where the others are extremely low in numbers, especially in the one in the bottom, right? So in this case, actually, but on the left side, you can see there are more species here. At the same time, even the number of individuals from the same species are less than here. So in this case, we can call the left side is more diverse than the right side. But by just looking at this kind of chart alone, we can't say that whether it is diverse or not. And that's where you have to use some sort of diversity indices, right? Some equations or indices to measure the species diversity. So one of such a species diversity index is called the Simpson's index. As you can see in this slide, that explains the species diversity. And D is the diversity index, that the Simpson's diversity index equal Ni, right? Ni is the number of individuals in a species I. In the ith species, number of individuals, and N is the total population of that particular species. So if you know these things, and you can calculate this species diversity.
We're talking about why
likewise,
biodiversity is important.
There are many different indices. Actually, it's not only the species diversity indices. I mean, not the Simpson's index, but there are other indexes like I forgot the name, right? H prime, and I forgot the name. I'll come to that one later. So, and likewise, there are many different species diversity indices where you can calculate the species diversity, right?
We're talking about.
All right, that's about the diversity. And when we talk about the diversity, in the ecology, we talk about the different versions of ecology, actually the alpha diversity, beta diversity, the alpha diversity, right? This is a bit complicated, so I won't ask any question from these things, but if you are just to know what it is, the alpha, beta or gamma diversity, right? They're all same indices we can use to calculate them, but the difference is the scale and what level you are looking at. Right? Alpha, beta or gamma is actually, it's all depend on to what level you are looking at the diversity in that particular area. For example, in the university ground, like if you are looking at the in a small area, maybe the what you call is the high level, right? In that, if you are trying to calculate the diversity in that small area, and that we call it as the alpha diversity because you are considering very small area, right? Then the beta diversity is more, if you are with that diversity, if you are comparing it with the other, maybe from another area, maybe from Maharagam or other different area, if you are comparing this, or we are taking a large area, then that is called the beta diversity. And gamma diversity is if you are looking like, even you are considering the microbes, right? Everything in that habitat, even the microclimate changes, micro habitats in that, you are just looking at the grasses and counting the species. But if you are going to the soil and in the microbes as well, and then you are doing a detailed study on the diversity, and that's become gamma diversity, right? So if you didn't understand, you can ask me again. Alpha, beta, gamma it's the same diversity, but it's all depend on what you are looking at and in what scale, right? Especially if you are as an undergraduate level, you will most likely will be considering the alpha diversity or very limited area. Beta diversity a little bit further, and gamma diversity is a full-scale biodiversity surveys, including the microbes, right? So if you didn't understand, just forget about these things. Alpha, beta, gamma, right? Right. Other than that, there are many other different indices that you can use within a community. But actually, this Lincoln index, actually, I forgot to mention in the actually under the population ecology. When determining a population size, like using some sort of a mark recapture method, I think I didn't mention about the mark recapture method because usually we discuss these things in the field when we are before going to the field. Mark recapture method is, if you want to estimate how many grasshoppers in the university grounds, then you catch some grasshoppers, you see how many of them there, you mark them with some maybe paint or something, and you put them back to the natural environment, let it go for some time, maybe several months or years, and again you catch them and you count how many you catch them back, and among what you have catched, you see how many of them has the marking, whether the paint that you have marked. If you know these numbers, if you know the total, how many individuals you caught, right? You see then you can calculate the size of the population. The size of the first sample, that is how many individuals you caught and painted. Then the N2 is the number in the second sample, total number, and the R is the number of recaptures, right? And if you know these numbers, then you can calculate the population size, right? It's called the Lincoln index, right? And likewise, there are many other, so many different actually terms to discuss, but they become a little bit complicated. But other than that, the species diversity, there are a few other, something like a dominance, right? And diversity versus dominance. This is something you have to understand. So diversity means how many different types of species, right? The dominance is actually the opposite. The dominance, like if there is one species, then the dominance is one. Right? So dominance is one, which means there's one species. Then diversity is less diverse, so one species. So that is the dominance, right? So dominance means less diversity. Right. All right. What else we have to Right. So other than that, within a community, there are so many other different terms as well. So I know this may be a little bit difficult for you, but you just try to understand different terms that you need to learn as a ecologist, especially as a community ecologist, right? Few more terms very briefly. The first one is the keystone species. I'm pretty sure that you have heard about this, the keystone species. Maybe for your advanced level, you have already heard about that. Locally we call Murugal Vishesha. I think you have heard about that, right? Keystone species. Right. So definition of keystone species, a species that has a disproportionate impact on the community relative to its abundance. Right. I'm not too sure whether you got it. Right. Disproportionate impact. Right. You know, like maybe in some areas, one species may be very dominant, but they might not have a serious role in that community. But whereas in one community, there may be one species, they're not dominant, maybe few individuals, but their existence is very important for that ecosystem or that community. In that case, that species called a keystone species, right? Right. It's not always they need to be a dominant species. They need not to be dominant species. Rarely they can be dominant as well, but they have a key role in that community, right? That's where the keystone species come. Now the problem is not like dominant species. If you remove dominant species, the other species will take the role. But the problem is if you remove a keystone species, that the whole ecosystem, the whole community will destabilize, right? So that's the importance of a keystone species in a particular community, right? So keystone species, they do a lot of some sort of a role, as I mentioned before, as some sort of interaction. That role, they might change the habitat, or they may be supporting the others to develop in the habitat. Likewise, they will do many different services to that community, right? So basically, there are 4 different types of keystone species, right? The 4 types of keystone species, the organisms controlling dominance, right? Some keystone species are actually predators. So they keep the populations under that community in checked. So they keep the numbers low by eating or by predation. So it's very important that their role. Otherwise, the species in the other food chain, the food chain immediately below will be removed from this keystone species, right? Then the second one is the resource providers, right? Maybe some trees or maybe even some species. They provide these resources for that community. Without them provide that resource, the community won't exist. The whole community will break if they don't provide that resource. So this is they also can be named as a keystone species. Then the keystone mutualist, the mutualist, they by this, they both the individuals will be benefited from in this case, keystone mutualistic relationship, right? And then the 4th type is called the ecosystem engineers. So they become a keystone species by becoming serving as an engineer. For example, we take the earthworm. perhaps. I mean, the earthworm is not really a keystone, but I'm talking about the ecosystem engineers. They can change the ecosystem that the others can inhabit. So in that case, they consider it as a keystone species, right? So if you didn't understand about the keystone species or the types of keystone species, I have a slide here. You can go through with some examples, right? So organism controlling dominance, that's the prey, predator, the resource providers, that's mainly the primary reproducers for the whole community, uh, like a fig tree, which provide the nutrition for the most of the animals living in that community. The mutualism, mutualistic relationship, right? And the other one is the ecosystem engineers, something like, for example, elephants, especially the Asian elephants. They can serve as a ecosystem engineers, or they can be really a keystone species. Without them, actually, if it is a forest, what they do is, I think I should have another slide that will explain these things. But the ecosystem engineers, they do some sort of a service to that ecosystem, some engineering service, so change in the habitat, which allow others to grow, right? So that their role is very important for their for that community, right? Right. And in this case, you see the elephants. In this case, it's African elephants. Even the Asian elephants, sometimes they can be a keystone species because they eat on this the big trees. They fell these big trees and allowing the underground crops to grow, or the other small plants to grow, which provide the food for many species, for especially the grazing animals. Otherwise, there won't be any grasses, and this ecosystem will be destroyed, right? So elephants are very important in this case, right? And likewise, the many example. And this is another example for keystone species. In this case, the same example as I mentioned before, the sea star, the starfish here, versus the barnacles, right? The starfish versus barnacles in this case, or rather actually the mussels, a type of barnacles, the mussels. So they eat on barnacles. In the absence, if you remove this sea stars, what happened? The barnacles starts, rather the mussels start proliferating. So they will increase their numbers so quickly and going to spread everywhere. And that will destroy the whole ecosystem. That's why you have to keep some this kind of a keystone species. Their role is very important, right? And this is another example where the sea otters serve as a keystone species because they keep the number of sea urchins, because the sea otters, they eat sea urchin. If they don't, then sea urchin going to eat a lot of this the plants, especially the kelp, and they will destroy the whole kelp forest where the sea communities depend on, right? But very importantly, the otters will keep the sea urchin numbers down, and there won't be harm to the kelp forest. But what happens if you remove the sea otters? Then the sea urchins start proliferating. They will increase their numbers and they will start eating the kelp forest, and then that will destroy the whole forest, and that whole ecosystem or whole community or the whole food web will be affected, right? So that's how the keystone species can impact on the particular habitat, right? And that's the keystone species. There is another term, it's called the foundation species, right? Today, there are a lot of terms I hope you will go through these terms again and then you get a clear understanding what they are. I'm not expecting a lot of information on this, but at least you need to understand the concept of keystone as well as foundation species, right? So foundation species, right? Actually, they are, as the name suggests, it's a foundation, right? They allow the other individuals to exist in that environment. So they support the others to exist in that particular. They give some sort of support, and that's where the foundations be, right? So the description is here. Keystone species are the species that have a greater effect on all the other species in ecosystem, while foundation species are the species that play a major role in creating and maintaining habitat for other species. So perhaps they can create even the new habitat they will create. And best example is the corals, right? The coral can be a foundation species because once the corals build a reef, that reef support a lot of other individuals, and that's where coral reefs become a foundation species. They can be a foundation species, right? Uh, so whether they are keystone or not, it's different case, but in this case, it's a foundation species, right? Okay, that is the foundation species. And there's another term called ecotone. Like within a biological communities or even within an ecosystem, you will see something called these ecotones. Ecotones are the regions of transition between the two biological communities, right? Like in this case, a forest and a lake, and maybe estuary or other area in between the forest and that is serves as a ecotone, like uh, um, in between two different type of habitats, right? So the important thing is in an ecotone, because it's influenced by both the habitat, right? They get influence from both the forest in this case as well as the lake. So they usually have very high biodiversity, right? Diversity is very high in this kind of area. Right now, the second thing is the in a ecotone, actually, uh, the diversity as well as uh, number of species. You can see the number of species also increased, as the diversity, right? Right. That is the ecotone, and there is another one word that's called ecotype. Too many ecos today. The ecotype is actually, you know what is a phenotype, right? So in very simple terms, the ecotype is like a same species, but with a little bit different genetic structure adapted for different environments, right? I have given an example here. Some aquatic plants, one ecotype best adapted to surviving in moist conditions. So one ecotype adapted for like a wet conditions, while the other one is for dry conditions. So they have a little distinct genetic structure, but pretty much same, but genetically a little different from one another. So in this case, they have two different ecotypes, right? That is the ecotype. All right. It's already 2 hours gone. So that's all we have to discuss on the first section of community ecology. And in the next time, we will discuss further, a little bit further on the community ecology, in particularly the ecological succession.